Mabel Johnson sat in the sterile white room, the hum of fluorescent lights above her a constant reminder of her years. Her frail hands, gnarled with age and worn from decades of hard labor, gripped the edge of the examination table. She had worked her whole life, from sunup to sundown, cleaning other people's homes, cooking meals for families who didn't know her name, and raising children with a strength that most people couldn't even fathom. Her back ached from years of bending over sinks. Her feet swelled from hours spent standing on floors that never seemed to care. But it was the pain in her chest, a sharp, unbearable ache that hadn't gone away for days, that brought her here today. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic, the cold air biting her skin, but nothing could make her feel more exposed than the look the nurse had given her when she entered. The woman, white, middle-aged, with a clipboard tucked under her arm, had barely acknowledged Mabel's presence when she walked in, eyes scanning the paper in her hand as if it was all that mattered. She asked a few basic questions, her tone distant, clinical. Mabel's body, weary and aching, had grown used to being treated like this, as if she were invisible. As if she didn't deserve the same respect as the white people who filled the hospital waiting room. But the pain was new. And she couldn't ignore it. The nurse took her vitals with a mechanical detachment, hardly looking up. "You've had this pain for how long?" she asked, as if it were just another symptom to be filed away. "A few days," Mabel replied, her voice crackling with a mix of exhaustion and frustration. The nurse scribbled something on her chart, barely acknowledging her. "I'll have the doctor come in." Mabel's heart sank, but she said nothing. The door clicked shut behind the nurse, leaving Mabel alone in this dark room, her thoughts swirling. For a moment, she allowed herself to close her eyes, to rest her head against the cool surface of the table. But when the door opened again, it was not the doctor she expected. A tall, white man in a lab coat stepped in, holding a clipboard and looking far too busy to be bothered. Mabel tried to sit up straighter, but her back protested with a sharp stab of pain. "How can I help you today, ma'am?" the doctor asked, his tone cold and professional, a practiced smile on his face. "I've been having pain in my chest," Mabel said, her voice steady, but inside, she felt the familiar weight of doubt pressing down. She had lived too long in a world where her pain never seemed to matter, where her body was just another problem to be dealt with, a nuisance. "When did it start?" the doctor asked, not looking at her, but at the clipboard. "A few days ago," she repeated. "It's sharp. It doesn't go away." The doctor nodded, scribbling something down. "I see," he said, glancing up for a moment, then quickly looking back down at the paper. "Well, at your age, it's probably just stress or anxiety. You know, the things that come with getting older." Mabel's heart skipped a beat. The dismissiveness in his voice was too familiar, a reminder of the countless times her concerns had been brushed aside. "It's not stress," she said, her voice firm, though the exhaustion was creeping in. "I know my own body." The doctor barely looked up, tapping his pen against the clipboard. "We'll run some tests, but I'm sure it's nothing serious," he said, his words dismissive, as if her suffering could be so easily explained away. He turned to leave without a word of comfort, without offering a plan for what would happen next. Mabel felt the familiar sting of anger rising in her chest. She had lived through the pain of discrimination her entire life, first as a child in the segregated South, then as a young woman working in the homes of white families who never saw her as anything more than a servant. She had fought for her place in a world that seemed determined to keep her down. But this was something different. This was a reminder that even in the most intimate spaces, in the places where she should feel safe, the color of her skin still determined how she was treated. She was a black woman, and that meant her pain, her body, her very existence was always second to others. As she sat there, the door opening and closing behind her, a sense of resignation began to creep in. She wasn't going to be heard. She never was. There would always be someone more important than her. And as much as it burned, As much as it hurt to admit, she had learned long ago to carry that pain quietly. But something inside her was breaking. She couldn't let this go. She couldn't be dismissed this time. When the nurse returned, Mabel was ready. "I need to see another doctor," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The nurse paused, clearly surprised. "Another doctor?" she asked, as if the request were an insult. "Yes," Mabel replied, standing up slowly, her body trembling with both fear and defiance. "Someone who will listen." The nurse didn't respond, just nodded stiffly and walked out. Mabel stood there, her mind racing. She had spent her whole life working in silence, bearing burdens she never should have had to bear. But this was different. She had lived through segregation, had faced the harsh realities of racism at every turn, but this was something new. This was the system failing her. The doctor returned shortly after, a new, older white man with an air of professionalism about him. He introduced himself, but Mabel barely heard his words. She was already tired of being polite, tired of being patient, tired of waiting for someone to take her seriously. "I've been in pain," she began, her voice unwavering now. "And I need you to treat me as if I matter. Because I do." The doctor looked at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, he nodded slowly, his gaze shifting from her face to the chart in his hands. "I'll order some tests," he said. "We'll see what's going on." Mabel's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't let her guard down. She knew better than to hope. She had lived too long in a world that had taught her to expect the worst. Yet, as the doctor left the room, she couldn't help but feel something she hadn't felt in a long time, the faintest glimmer of hope. A few days later, the results came back. Mabel had a blocked artery. The doctor apologized for the oversight, for not having taken her concern seriously sooner. But Mabel didn't feel relief. She felt the weight of the system that had failed her and countless others. She knew that her story wasn't unique. There were so many like her, so many black men and women whose voices had been silenced, whose suffering had been ignored. The road to recovery would be long, and she wasn't sure if she could trust the system again. But she had survived. And in that survival, there was power. As she left the hospital, her body aching but her spirit unbroken, she knew that her fight wasn't over. She would continue to raise her voice. She would continue to speak out, for herself and for those who couldn't. Because no matter how many times they tried to silence her, she knew her worth. And she would never stop fighting for it. Mabel's steps grew heavier as she made her way through the hospital's cold, sterile hallways, the bright white walls glaring at her like the sharp edges of a blade. She passed by nurses and doctors, their indifferent eyes glancing over her as though she were just another patient, a part of the machinery that churned through its daily cycle of care, or lack thereof. But she wasn't just another patient. She was a woman who had lived a lifetime in a world that denied her dignity, denied her humanity, and she was done letting it continue. As she reached the front door of the hospital, she paused for a moment, just outside the sliding glass doors, her eyes fixed on the world beyond. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the city. The air was thick with the humidity of late summer, but to Mabel, it felt like freedom, fresh, open, a chance to breathe again. She had been fighting for so long. Sometimes it felt like the fight was all she had left. But now, something inside her had changed. The truth about her health, about the years she had spent carrying the weight of a body that was continually dismissed, finally laid bare, made her realize just how much she had been forced to endure. The fear in her chest that had once seemed so suffocating, so overwhelming, was now a quiet fury, a fire that refused to be put out. The next morning, Mabel walked into the hospital with a new determination. She wasn't going to let them forget about her. She wasn't going to be invisible anymore. It was hard to ignore the stares from the staff, the way the white faces at the front desk stiffened when she approached, but she didn't care. She had earned the right to be there. She had earned the right to be heard. She walked straight into the office of the head nurse, a woman who had treated her with such blatant disregard just days before. "I need to speak to the hospital administrator," Mabel said, her voice calm but steady. The nurse looked up at her, clearly shocked by her sudden assertiveness, but Mabel didn't flinch. She had seen that look too many times in her life, the look that said a black woman had no business asking for things. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the nurse stammered, glancing nervously at the door. "Is there something we can do for you? You can start by treating me with some respect," Mabel replied, her voice low but firm. "I've been here long enough to know how this place works, and I'm done being brushed aside. I want to speak to someone who can make a difference." The nurse hesitated, looking at Mabel as if trying to figure out how to handle this unexpected challenge. But before she could respond, Mabel turned and walked out of the office, her heels clicking purposefully on the tile floors. She wasn't going to beg. She wasn't going to plead for the dignity she had already earned. If they wouldn't listen to her, she would make them listen. A few hours later, Mabel found herself sitting across from a young white man in a suit, his face a mask of politeness. "Miss Johnson," he began, his tone clipped but respectful, "I understand you have some concerns." Mabel didn't waste time. "I've been here long enough to see how things are run. I've been a patient in this hospital, and I've been treated like I don't matter. I've watched white patients walk in and out of here while I'm left waiting, while my pain is dismissed. And I know I'm not the only one. This system, this hospital, it's built on inequality. And I'm here to tell you that I won't stand for it anymore." The administrator didn't say anything for a moment, his eyes flicking nervously to the door. But Mabel was done being ignored. She wasn't going to let him dismiss her. "This isn't about me, sir," she continued, her voice steady but rising with the quiet power of someone who had been silenced for too long. "This is about the people who come here, people like me, who are treated like second-class citizens in the very place where we should be cared for. You don't get to ignore that anymore." The administrator shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He cleared his throat. "I assure you, Miss Johnson, that we take all complaints seriously." "Then start by changing how you treat the people who look like me," Mabel shot back. "Start by acknowledging that this hospital, like every other institution in this country, has a history of discrimination. And until you make real changes, it won't matter how many complaints you take." The words hung in the air between them, charged with the weight of history, of years of injustice that had been swept under the rug, of lives ignored and lives lost. For a moment, the administrator's eyes flicked down to his desk, then back up at her. She saw the briefest flicker of recognition, as if something in her words had finally broken through the polished veneer of his professional indifference. "I'll bring this up with the board," he said, his voice stiff. "But I can't promise anything immediately." "That's what I thought," Mabel replied, standing up. She wasn't expecting change overnight. She wasn't even expecting it at all. But that wasn't the point. The point was that she had been heard. And that was more than she had ever been given before. Mabel left the office with her head held high, her heart still pounding with the adrenaline of confrontation. She didn't know what would happen next. But she had done what she came to do. She had made her voice known. That evening, as she sat in her small apartment, the weight of the day settled heavily in her bones. The pain in her chest still lingered, though it had become less sharp, less threatening. The doctors had told her to take it easy, to rest, to follow up in a few weeks. But Mabel wasn't one for resting. Resting had never been a luxury she could afford. Instead, she spent the evening writing letters, letters to the hospital, letters to the city council, letters to anyone she thought might listen. She wrote of the ways the system failed people like her, the ways that silence perpetuated the very things she had lived through. She wrote because that was what she could do. She couldn't change the world in a day, but she could make it uncomfortable, make it impossible for those who held the power to ignore the truth. And maybe, just maybe, she could inspire someone to fight beside her. The letters were just the beginning. Mabel knew her battle wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. But she felt something she hadn't felt in years. The faintest, flickering hope that maybe, just maybe, change was possible. As she finished the last letter, she set down her pen and looked out the window at the darkening sky. The world seemed vast, full of injustice, full of darkness, but it also held the possibility of light. And in that light, she saw a future where her voice, and the voices of so many others like her, could finally be heard. Mabel's days became filled with the quiet intensity of her mission, each morning spent in a blur of determination as she wrote more letters, gathered stories from others, and worked tirelessly to keep the pressure on those who were in power. Her apartment, once a place of solace, now felt like a war room, every inch covered in paper, ink, and the weight of the fight she had started. She didn't want to believe that the work would be in vain, but with every rejection, every lack of response from the hospital or the board, it became harder to keep the faith. The response she did get came in the form of silence, a deep, suffocating silence that only confirmed what she already knew: change would come slowly, if at all. But it didn't stop her. Every day she walked to the hospital, determined to face the cold looks and the hidden disdain. Every day, the nurses and doctors who passed her by showed no signs of change. Yet, there were small victories, moments of recognition that, perhaps, the seed she had planted had begun to sprout. A nurse, once dismissive, began to greet her with a slight smile instead of a cold glance. A doctor, who had once seemed indifferent to her pain, now seemed to linger a little longer during their interactions, though the distance in his eyes remained. One day, as Mabel was sitting in the waiting room, she overheard two young nurses speaking quietly, unaware that she was listening. "Did you hear about that old woman?" one of them asked. "The one who's been making all that noise." The other nurse nodded. "Yeah, I hear she's been causing a lot of problems. But there's something about her, don't you think? She doesn't back down. It's like she refuses to be invisible anymore." Mabel's heart swelled at the words, a strange mixture of pride and sadness washing over her. She had become a symbol, perhaps an unwitting one, of resistance, a reminder of the fight that so many before her had waged and that so many continued to wage in silence. But she couldn't afford to be just a symbol. She needed to be more than that. She needed to see real change. She had to make sure that the fight wasn't lost in a sea of empty words and forgotten promises. As the weeks passed, she began to gather more allies, not just in the hospital, but within her community as well. People who had lived through the same injustices, who had been ignored, neglected, and pushed aside, began to come forward, sharing their stories with her. And Mabel listened. She listened to the woman whose child had died because the doctors had refused to take her seriously when she begged for help. She listened to the man who had been denied the proper treatment for his heart condition simply because his skin was darker. She listened, and each story she heard added fuel to the fire that burned inside her. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for all of them. It was a cold morning when Mabel received the letter. She had been expecting it, in a way, but that didn't make it any easier. The hospital had acknowledged her complaints, but in the most formal, detached way possible, offering little more than a polite response with no concrete action or commitment. They had listened, but only enough to placate her. They had offered no apology, no change in policy, no indication that the system would be reformed. She read the letter twice, her hands trembling as she realized that the fight was far from over. She knew, deep in her bones, that nothing would change unless they were forced to change. And forcing change, she realized, would take more than just letters. It would take action. A plan began to form in her mind. Mabel started organizing meetings in her neighborhood, bringing together the people who had suffered alongside her, people who were sick and tired of waiting for justice to come on its own. She encouraged them to speak out, to share their stories, to refuse to be ignored. They met in secret, in the back rooms of churches, in homes where the doors were closed to the world. The secrecy was necessary. The risks were too great. But in those rooms, there was power. There was solidarity. And there was hope. Mabel didn't know how far this would go, or what kind of resistance they might face, but she knew that this was their moment. She wasn't going to let it slip away. A few weeks later, after much planning, the time came for their first public demonstration. Mabel stood outside the hospital, her heart pounding in her chest, as she looked at the small crowd that had gathered. There were faces she knew, others that she didn't, but they were all here for the same reason: to demand accountability. To demand that the hospital, and the healthcare system as a whole, stop treating black patients like they were invisible. Mabel wasn't sure what to expect. She had been afraid of the consequences, of the backlash, of being ignored once more. But as she looked out at the faces in the crowd, all united in their shared struggle, something shifted inside her. This wasn't just her fight anymore. This was a movement. The protest was small, peaceful, but the power of it was undeniable. The media coverage was minimal at first, just a few local stations, but Mabel could see the wheels turning. She could see the people in power starting to take notice. And when a group of reporters showed up, cameras flashing, she knew that the conversation had finally started. For the first time, she felt like they were being heard. For the first time, the system could no longer ignore their voices. But the real challenge lay ahead. As Mabel walked home that night, her heart heavy with the weight of what had been started, she knew that the fight was far from over. The change they saw wouldn't come easily, and there would be many more battles to face. But she had made the first step. And in the quiet of her small apartment, as she looked out at the stars that twinkled above, Mabel knew one thing: she was no longer afraid. The world might try to silence her, try to erase her, but they couldn't stop her now. The truth was out, and there was no turning back. Mabel sat by her window as the first light of dawn broke over the city, the echoes of the protest still resonating in her ears like a call to arms that refused to be silenced, her heart still pounding with the fervor of a battle that had just begun. And as she gazed out at the empty street below, memories of a lifetime of neglect and sorrow mixed with a newfound determination that burned brighter than any injustice she had ever faced. The demonstration had been small but powerful, a quiet yet unyielding outcry against a system that had long relegated her and others like her to the margins of care and compassion. And in that moment, she realized that their voices, though soft, had the power to ripple through the corridors of power and force those in authority to listen, even if only for a fleeting moment. Yet, as the day unfolded, the weight of the repercussions began to settle in. A flurry of terse phone calls at the hospital, whispered conversations among the white staff, and subtle shifts in policy that seemed more like damage control than genuine reform. But Mabel refused to be deterred. Even as a group of older patients, many with stories as harrowing as hers, gathered around her in the cramped waiting room, their eyes alight with hope and exhaustion intertwined, as they recounted tales of neglect and mistreatment that had become all too familiar, and together they formed a small, defiant community bound by shared pain and the stubborn belief that change was possible. And Mabel took it upon herself to document every whispered account, every quiet act of defiance, every moment when the system faltered under the pressure of truth, writing long letters and recording their stories on scrap paper that she hid in a battered journal, her fingers trembling as they clutched the pen, each word a promise that their suffering would not be forgotten, that the legacy of injustice would be transformed into a rallying cry for accountability. And as the days turned into weeks, the protest grew in size and intensity, drawing the attention of local journalists who began to report on the disparity in care with a cautious curiosity that slowly morphed into outrage. And soon the hospital board was forced to issue statements and convene meetings behind closed doors, their voices measured and apologetic yet devoid of true commitment to structural change. But Mabel saw this as a victory, a sign that even the most entrenched systems could be stirred by the power of collective will. And as she walked the hospital corridors on subsequent visits, she noticed subtle shifts. A nurse who once looked away now offered a tentative smile. A doctor paused longer before dismissing her complaints, and though the change was slow and the scars of old abuses remained, each small act of acknowledgement was a light in the darkness, a reminder that their struggle was not in vain. And even as the resistance grew, so did the backlash. Hostile words whispered in the corridors, a sudden tightening of rules, and even threats delivered in hushed tones on street corners, all of which only steeled Mabel's resolve further, for she had learned that true change was born from the courage to speak out against injustice, even when the odds were stacked against you. And as she stood before a small crowd of fellow patients one afternoon, recounting her experiences and urging them to stand together in solidarity, she felt the weight of a lifetime lift just enough to let hope seep in. And it was then that a young man approached her, his eyes wide with admiration and his voice soft as he confessed that he had been inspired by her defiance to challenge his own doctor's dismissive attitude. And in that moment, Mabel saw the ripple effect of her actions, a glimpse of a future where the voices of the oppressed might one day drown out the cruelty of the powerful. Even as she knew the battle was far from over, and that the road ahead would be fraught with both setbacks and triumphs. And as the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, casting long shadows on the worn pavement, Mabel returned home with her journal clutched tightly to her chest, a quiet smile on her lips as she realized that though the struggle for dignity and justice in a system built on prejudice was an unending one, each act of resistance, each moment of unity, was a step toward a brighter, if uncertain, future. And she sat by her window once more, watching the stars emerge one by one, pondering the cost of survival and the price of change, wondering if the tides of time might one day wash away the stains of discrimination, but knowing deep in her soul that as long as voices like hers were raised in defiance, hope would persist in even the darkest corners of the world. Mabel's resolve, though solid, began to wear thin as the months went by. The pressure mounted from every direction, within the hospital, the community, and her own body, which had spent so many years enduring the cruelty of age and sickness. The constant strain of battling a system designed to keep her silent gnawed at her spirit, but she could not stop now. She had seen too much, endured too much. The protest had grown larger, had brought with it a louder outcry, but there was always resistance, a constant churn of indifference, dismissal, or outright hostility from those in power. The hospital board had promised to address the disparities, but their actions spoke volumes. There was no real change, only half-hearted measures that placated the public. Doctors and nurses, some more than others, still dismissed black patients' pain, treated them as secondary, as lesser. Mabel had spent her life fighting for scraps, for the barest recognition of her worth, but it was in the halls of this institution that she felt most invisible, most disregarded. She had seen the way they treated Sarah, the young white woman in the bed next to hers, who had been given attention, comfort, and the benefit of doubt every time she spoke, while Mabel was sent home with little more than a shrug, her complaints ignored. The day she overheard two doctors, her doctor and another, discussing her in hushed tones, laughing, as if she were nothing more than a case number, a statistic, something inside her broke, but in that moment, it also solidified her purpose. They thought they could break her, that they could make her feel like she was worth less than the air she breathed, but what they didn't realize was that Mabel had lived her whole life carrying the weight of racism, the weight of injustice, and yet she had never buckled, not truly. They were mistaken if they thought she would bow now, with the end of her life on the horizon. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for all of them, the ones still silenced, the ones who had been lost in the cracks of a system designed to oppress. And so she fought, quietly but fiercely, with every ounce of her being, penning letters, gathering testimonies, speaking in the faces of apathy, no longer afraid to expose the truth, no longer willing to be quiet. Yet, the truth was not always easy to bear. Each new revelation from the patients she spoke to was a wound on her soul. Stories of those left to die in hospital rooms, ignored, dismissed, their pain unseen by those who held the power to change it. And then, one day, it happened. A young nurse, new to the hospital, stopped her in the hallway. Mabel didn't recognize her at first, but the nurse's voice trembled as she spoke, and Mabel could feel the weight of something heavy in the air. "I've been reading the reports," the nurse whispered, her eyes darting nervously. The things that are happening here, the way people like you are treated. It's wrong." "I'm sorry, Mabel." The nurse's words hit her with the force of a storm, each syllable resonating deeply, for she could hear the truth in the young woman's voice. She had seen it, understood it, and yet had chosen to remain silent until now. This moment, this brief connection, felt like a spark of hope in a sea of darkness. Mabel, for the first time in months, allowed herself to feel a glimmer of something other than anger, and it was not a relief, but a strange sadness, the realization that this young woman's conscience had been awakened far too late. The next few days were a blur, another round of hospital visits, more dismissals, more complaints ignored, but something had changed. The stories of other patients, once heard only in whispers, began to find a way into the open. The press had started paying attention, and the pressure on the hospital to act, to address its systemic failure, grew unbearable. Mabel's face became known to the community. People started to recognize her, nod to her in the streets, some offering their thanks, others asking her how they could help. The fight was becoming bigger than she had ever anticipated, and yet the costs were beginning to show. Mabel's health was deteriorating faster now, the strain of the years catching up to her. The fight, though righteous, was taking its toll. But she could not stop now, she thought, even as the world around her seemed to close in. One night, she lay in her hospital bed, her body aching from the relentless march of time, but her mind sharp as ever. She had received another call from the press. Another story, another round of attention. She was becoming a symbol, an image, and yet she felt more than ever that she was just a woman, one single life fighting against a vast tide of hatred and oppression. She thought of the faces of the young patients she had met, the ones who were just starting to understand what it meant to live in a world that would never fully accept them. She thought of the young nurse, who had found the courage to speak up, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a deep sense of hope, a sense that the next generation might be able to fight the battles she never could. Yet, there was also a weight, an unspeakable loss in her chest, the knowledge that no matter how loud the outcry, no matter how many voices rose to challenge the system, the change would be slow, excruciatingly slow, and it would come at great cost. Mabel closed her eyes, the steady hum of the machines around her the only sound, and for a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to imagine a world where justice had already arrived, a world where her body, broken and bruised by decades of abuse, could find peace. She was not sure that world would come in her lifetime, but in the deepest corners of her heart, she had to believe that it was possible. That the fire she had kindled, the fight she had set in motion, would one day burn brighter than the darkness that had oppressed her for so long. As the night wore on, she allowed herself one last thought before sleep overcame her, a thought of resilience, of courage, of love in the face of pain, and the quiet, unyielding truth that no matter how much time passed, she would never, ever be forgotten. Mabel woke the next morning with the weight of the night still pressing on her chest, her body aching from the relentless struggle yet her spirit refusing to be subdued, and as she stepped out of her hospital bed, every joint protesting, every breath a reminder of the decades of neglect and abuse she had endured, she resolved to continue her fight with a fierceness that came from deep within. A resolve that had been forged in the fires of segregation and injustice, a resolve that would not allow her to be silenced by a system that had dismissed her pain for far too long. She gathered the few belongings that remained, the worn-out journal filled with scrawled testimonies and letters of protest, and a small, battered photo of her younger self smiling amidst fields of cotton, a relic of a past when hope still seemed possible, and stepped into the sterile corridor of the hospital, determined to confront every dismissive glance, every cold, indifferent word that had defied her treatment. For so many years, with each step, She recalled the whispered words of the young nurse who had confessed her own guilt and the promise of change, the voices of countless patients whose stories had been buried in the dust of systemic cruelty, and she felt the spark of a movement that had been growing, quiet and persistent, beneath the weight of oppression, a movement that now demanded to be seen and heard. As she made her way to the administrative office once more, her eyes burning with a mix of sorrow and righteous fury, she found herself face to face with a new administrator, a man whose polite veneer barely concealed a deep-seated prejudice, and without pausing to gather her thoughts, she launched into a passionate declaration of her rights, her dignity, and her unwavering refusal to be treated as invisible, her voice echoing off the sterile walls as she recounted decades of disregard and neglect, each word a hammer striking against the iron grip of a system built on bias. The administrator, taken aback by the force of her conviction, tried to offer empty assurances, promising that changes were coming, that improvements would be made, but Mabel knew all too well that such promises were as fragile as the paper on which they were written, and in that moment, a quiet murmur of support arose from the waiting area, where fellow patients and even a few sympathetic staff members, their eyes filled with a shared pain and secret hope, gathered to bear witness to her defiance. Their silent solidarity a beacon in the gloom. Emboldened by this unexpected display of unity, Mabel resolved to take her fight beyond the confines of the hospital, to organize community meetings and bring together those who had suffered at the hands of a callous healthcare system, to transform her personal struggle into a collective cry for justice that could not be ignored by those in power. And as word spread of her courage, local activists and journalists began to show interest there, presence lending the promise of change even as they documented the harsh realities that Mabel and others faced on a daily basis. In the midst of this growing movement, a startling revelation emerged from the depths of her past, a long-forgotten diary from her mother, discovered in the attic of her childhood home, filled with accounts of silent suffering, resilience in the face of relentless racial discrimination, and the secret alliances formed among black women who had dared to challenge the oppressive norms of their time, a revelation that not only redefined Mabel's understanding of her own strength but also connected her to a legacy of resistance that spanned generations, a legacy that now pulsed through her veins and resonated in every protest sign she helped to create, every letter she penned, and every quiet conversation held in the dark corners of the community center. As the movement gained momentum, Mabel found herself thrust into the public eye, her face and story becoming symbols of the hidden biases in medicine and the broader systemic injustices that plague the nation. And though the spotlight was both a blessing and a curse, bringing with it the risk of further discrimination and personal attacks, she embraced it with a fierce determination, speaking at rallies, sharing her painful experiences with reporters, and inspiring others to demand accountability from the very institutions that had long dismissed their suffering. However, the battle was far from won. For as the movement grew louder, so too did the backlash, and Mabel began receiving threatening letters and hushed warnings, the voices of those who sought to maintain the status quo rising in anger and desperation. And in one harrowing incident, as she left a community meeting in the dead of night, a car followed her down a lonely road, its headlights slicing through the darkness like a promise of retribution, forcing her to run through the rain-soaked streets, her heart pounding in terror and defiance, until she finally found refuge in a cramped, dimly lit apartment shared by other activists, where the sound of her ragged breathing mingled with whispered plans and shared vows to keep fighting, no matter the cost. In the weeks that followed, the pressure on the hospital mounted, with local officials forced to convene meetings and debate policy changes. And while Mabel knew that true transformation would be slow and fraught with setbacks, she also recognized that every small victory, the slight improvement in care for black patients, the opening of a dialogue about racial bias in healthcare, the glimmer of acknowledgement in a sympathetic nurse's eyes, was a step toward a future where justice might one day prevail. Yet even as the movement began to ripple through the community, Mabel felt a deep, persistent loneliness. a haunting reminder that her life had been defined by struggle and isolation long before she had become a symbol of resistance. And on quiet nights when the noise of protests and rallies faded into the silence of the early hours, she would lie awake, tracing the scars on her skin with her fingertips, mourning the dreams that had been deferred and the loved ones lost to a system that valued profit over people. But each morning, as the first light of dawn crept through the window, and the distant hum of the city stirred her awake, she would rise again, driven by a quiet, unyielding belief that every voice raised in defiance was a victory against the tide of injustice. And as she continued to write, to protest, to speak out against the systemic neglect and racial discrimination that had marred her life, Mabel knew that her journey was far from over, that the road ahead would be long and perilous, filled with both hope and heartbreak, and that the true cost of survival and the weight of injustice would forever be etched in her soul, a soul that, despite it all, burned with the determination to fight for a future where no one would have to suffer in silence, where every life would be valued equally. And as she looked out at the star-filled night sky from her modest apartment, Mabel felt a deep, unspoken promise that her struggle, her voice, and the legacy of those who had come before her would continue to spark the flames of change, even if the outcome remained uncertain, leaving her to wonder if true transformation was possible in a world so long accustomed to turning a blind eye, yet clinging to that fragile hope as the night deepened, as the voices of her fellow activists joined in a chorus of resilience, and as she whispered to the darkness, "We will not be forgotten," knowing that in that moment, in that echo of defiance, lay the promise of a better tomorrow. Mabel rose from her modest chair with a heaviness in her bones that belied the fierce determination burning in her eyes. As she stepped out into the cool early morning, the city still shrouded in a mist that seemed to whisper secrets of past struggles and future hopes, and as she walked the familiar yet forever changed streets, every step carried the weight of the voices that had joined her protest, the murmurs of fellow patients, the resolute whispers of community members who had once lived in the shadows of neglect. And though the hospital had not yet transformed into the beacon of care it was meant to be, the ripples of change she had sparked were now impossible to ignore. In the days that followed, Mabel organized small meetings in the back rooms of community centers, where survivors of discrimination and neglect gathered in defiant solidarity, sharing painful stories of being dismissed by doctors who saw their ailments as mere inconveniences, recounting how white patients received timely treatments and compassionate care while they were left to languish with their pain, and every story added fuel to the collective fire, igniting a resolve that could not be quenched by bureaucratic apathy or systemic injustice. For in those secret gatherings, amidst whispered plans and determined glances, Mabel began to craft a manifesto, a declaration of dignity, and a call to arms against the callousness of an institution that had treated her and her people as if their suffering were invisible. And with each passing day, the movement grew, spreading like a wildfire across neighborhoods, drawing attention from local journalists and sympathetic voices within the medical community who had long felt the sting of an unequal system. And soon, the very hospital that had once turned its back on her began to tremble under the weight of mounting public pressure, as protests swelled outside its windows, demanding accountability and reform. And while the board offered empty promises and half-hearted apologies, Mabel pressed on, channeling her decades of quiet endurance into speeches that reverberated in the hearts of the oppressed, urging them to stand tall and demand the respect they deserved, even as she herself grappled with the physical toll of years of neglect and the emotional scars of a life marred by systemic cruelty. One humid afternoon, as she stood before a modest crowd of supporters on a street corner, her voice steady and unwavering despite the tremors in her aging frame, she revealed a hidden truth from her past, an old diary belonging to her mother that chronicled the secret alliances formed among black women in the segregated South, alliances that had fought silently against injustice and had passed down the knowledge of self-worth and resistance through the generations. And in that moment, as her words cascaded over the gathered crowd like a baptism of truth, Mabel saw in their eyes the spark of a new era, an era where the pain of the past would no longer be a chain, but a foundation upon which to build a more just future. And yet, even as she stirred the embers of hope, there were nights when the darkness threatened to overwhelm her, when the loneliness of being a symbol of a struggle that had caused so many seemed too heavy to bear, and she would lie awake in her small room, the silence punctuated only by the soft hum of the city outside, pondering whether the sacrifices made, the countless lives lost in quiet despair, could ever truly be redeemed by the slow, painful march of progress. Still, every letter she wrote, every protest she led, every conversation she held with a nurse, a doctor, a neighbor who finally dared to see her as more than a statistic, added another thread to the tapestry of resistance, weaving a story that was as much about the individual struggle for dignity as it was about the collective demand for justice. And as the seasons changed, and the once oppressive heat gave way to the cool relief of autumn, the movement she had ignited began to show signs of tangible change. A committee was formed to review patient care policies. A new training program on cultural sensitivity was introduced, and slowly, imperceptibly at first, the attitude of the hospital staff began to shift, though the road ahead was still fraught with setbacks, and the scars of decades of abuse would not vanish overnight. Yet in the quiet moments of victory, when a young nurse approached Mabel with a genuine smile, or a doctor took extra time to listen to her concerns, she found solace, a brief respite from the constant battle. And though Mabel knew that the fight for equality was an endless one, that the wounds inflicted by systemic racism would forever leave their mark on her community, she also recognized that the light of change, however dim at times, was beginning to break through the darkness, promising that one day the echoes of injustice might finally be silenced by the roar of a unified, resilient people, determined to reclaim their worth. And as Mabel looked out at the twilight, the stars beginning to pierce the velvet sky, she whispered to herself, "We will not be forgotten." A promise that transcended her own suffering, a vow that the struggle for justice, for respect, for the right to be seen and heard, would carry on, long after the tears had dried and the scars had faded, leaving behind a legacy of courage and an enduring hope that one day, true change would be more than just a whispered dream in the corridors of time. As Mabel stood at the forefront of the movement, now recognized as a beacon of strength, she felt the weight of history upon her shoulders. She had spent years fighting to be seen, to be heard, but the struggle was never easy. Even as the protests grew louder and the change began to ripple through the system, Mabel found herself exhausted, worn by the fight that never seemed to end. The battles had been long, the toll on her body undeniable, but the fire in her heart kept her moving. Her health, once resilient, had begun to fail her. The same system that had denied her proper care all these years had now come to collect its debt. She had learned that the hardest fights weren't always the ones against others, but often the ones you had to fight within yourself. Still, Mabel persisted, drawing strength from those who stood with her, those who had felt the sting of injustice and, together, formed a tapestry of resistance. Her story had reached places she had never imagined, her face now as much a symbol of resilience as it was of grief, and the community she had helped to build rallied behind her, encouraging her to keep going even when the weight seemed unbearable. Mabel's voice had become a force, an unyielding call for respect, dignity, and equality that reached into every corner of the nation, forcing those in power to confront their own biases, their own prejudices. But as the days passed and the movement grew, Mabel began to feel the deepening sting of weariness, both physical and emotional. Her body, weakened by years of neglect and years of fighting, began to slow. It was on a chilly morning, while standing in front of a crowd of supporters, that Mabel found herself struggling to catch her breath. She tried to continue, pushing forward, but the energy seemed to drain from her, and she was forced to sit. The crowd, sensing the shift, fell silent. They were all too aware of what her presence meant, of what she had sacrificed. The rally, once filled with the sounds of hope and determination, suddenly felt heavy. Mabel smiled weakly at the crowd, her vision blurry from exhaustion, but her spirit still shone through. In that moment, she saw not just her own battle, but the collective struggle that had stretched out before her, and as the people around her began to chant, to lift their voices in solidarity, Mabel closed her eyes. She had given everything she had, and in return, she had seen a new generation rise. Young voices that would continue to carry the torch of justice, young hands that would pick up the fight where hers would eventually end. In her heart, she knew the battle was not over, but she was finally ready to rest. As Mabel's body weakened, the doctors, once indifferent to her pain, now found themselves offering her the very care they had denied her for so long. It was too little too late. The changes she had fought for were real, undeniable, but it was the weight of her own life that now rested in their hands. Her breaths came in shallow bursts, but as her vision dimmed, she found solace in knowing that her fight had not been in vain. The system she had spent a lifetime confronting had cracked, its facade of invincibility shattered by the sheer force of the people. Mabel's death came quietly, a sigh amidst the noise of a world that was beginning to change, but in the wake of her passing, something profound stirred within the people she had inspired. The hospital she had once stood before, unacknowledged and dismissed, was now under investigation, and policies were being rewritten. The very system that had once crushed her was now trembling beneath the weight of reform. As her community mourned, they also carried forward her legacy, one that would never be forgotten. They built on the foundation Mabel had laid, ensuring that future generations would never again be denied their worth. It was in the funeral procession, as thousands walked together in silence, that Mabel's daughter, now grown and a fierce advocate in her own right, stood at the front, carrying the torch of resistance that Mabel had passed down. The people's struggle was not over, but the path had been paved with Mabel's blood, sweat, and tears. She had fought not just for herself, but for every person whose humanity had been denied by a system built on inequity. Her fight had been a cry for justice, and though she was gone, the cry had been heard. The battle for equality had not ended with Mabel's passing, it had only begun. And so, the world moved forward, forever changed by the courage of one woman who had refused to be silent, who had refused to be invisible. The story of Mabel was now etched into the fabric of history, a reminder that even in the face of insurmountable odds, there is power in standing up, in speaking out, and in fighting for the dignity of every soul. The echoes of her voice lived on, resonating in the hearts of those who carried the torch after her, ensuring that her legacy would never be forgotten, that the injustices of the past would continue to be challenged, and that one day, true change would come, not because of one woman, but because of the many who followed her lead. Mabel's death sent shockwaves through the community, but her life had already sparked a flame that would burn long after her passing. The funeral procession was not just an act of mourning, it was a declaration of defiance. Those who had once been silent stood tall, their voices unburdened by the fear that had long kept them quiet. Mabel's daughter, now a woman of strength and resolve, stepped forward, holding the memory of her mother like a shield. She had watched Mabel's sacrifices, felt the weight of the years that had worn her down, but now, with Mabel gone, she understood the true meaning of her mother's fight. The movement that Mabel had led continued to grow, fed by the pain of those who had lost so much, but also by the hope she had instilled in them. The doctors and nurses who had once ignored Mabel's cries, who had turned their backs on her suffering, found themselves under scrutiny. The investigation into the hospital's racist practices became a catalyst for reform in healthcare. Policy shifted, and while the progress was slow, it was undeniable. Mabel's name became synonymous with the fight for justice, for dignity, for the simple acknowledgement of humanity. As the years passed, Mabel's story spread beyond the hospital walls, beyond the city streets where she had once stood in protest. Schools taught her story, activists carried her legacy, and a nation began to look inward, questioning its treatment of the marginalized. But even as the tides of change began to turn, Mabel's family, those who had known her pain most intimately, continued to fight for a better world. The battle was far from over, but Mabel's death had served as a reminder that change, while slow and painful, was possible. The truth of her life, her perseverance, her suffering, her unwavering belief in justice, was now embedded in the consciousness of a new generation. The injustice that had killed her would not go unanswered. The oppression that had tried to silence her would never be forgotten. Mabel's legacy would continue to inspire, to challenge, to demand a world where people like her were no longer invisible. Her story was not just one of suffering, it was one of resistance, of dignity, and of the unyielding power of the human spirit to fight against the tide of injustice. And so, with Mabel's passing, the world was forced to reckon with its own reflection in the mirror, to see the hidden biases that still ran deep, and to confront the systems that had allowed her to suffer in silence for so long. Her death was not the end of her fight. It was merely a new chapter, a reminder that as long as people like Mabel existed, the struggle for a just world would never truly be over. And as her daughter stood tall, holding her mother's memory in her heart, she knew that the work would continue, fueled by the love and sacrifice that Mabel had given, carrying the fight forward into a future that was slowly, painfully, but surely being reshaped by those who refused to remain silent.